All right, everyone. Jeremy Knauff here with another episode of the Public Relations Declassified live stream. And we're going to be talking about something that you guys may have seen in the news lately, and that is Cracker Barrel's failed rebrand. And essentially, this is a massive public relations lesson. So this is something that happened about a year ago, but it came back into the news cycle recently when their CEO had to step down as a result of how poorly this whole thing went. So a little bit of background. This is something I was talking about back in 2025 when it first broke. And for context, I'm going to pull up the original Cracker Barrel logo, which they redesigned into this piece of shit monstrosity that they presented as a modernized, right, finger quotes here, modernized version of the logo. And I think a more apt description would be bastardized. Essentially, they ignored who their target audience was and just designed it with their own, what they felt should be great. And this is something that when it first happened, I was cited in the media quite a bit about it. There was an article in Forbes where I did talk about this. And there was an aspect of this particular rebrand that, despite the fact that it went horribly, right? They did pretty much everything wrong leading up to and through the rebrand. But because the public response was so brutal, they did end up backtracking on that. And that was honestly the right call. And they did that pretty quickly. And that was one of my key elements in the interviews that I did on the topic as a public relations and a branding expert. Bud Light had a similar situation a few years before the Cracker Barrel rebrand, and they handled literally every aspect wrong and continued to double down long after the public backlash and never really recovered from that. Well, the eventual outcome of this situation was the CEO of Cracker Barrel ended up having to step down as a result of the controversy. So let's do a little after action report here. And that's military terminology. Basically, after a mission, we do an after action report, which basically analyzes everything we did, what we got right, what we got wrong, what could have been improved, all of that kind of stuff, what we learned from it, all of that. So for a little bit of context here, the whole rebranding campaign was first unveiled in August of 2025, and it dropped their original old school traditional logo, which was designed in 1977, featuring their iconic Uncle Herschel leaning against a barrel in the old country store, right? Where we are now is that the CEO, Julie Felss Masino, I may be pronouncing that wrong. She's the one who oversaw this whole project. Essentially, this week announced her departure from the company, right? She's gone. She's leaving. This occurred under her leadership, so she stepped down. Now, in my opinion, there should have been a lot more people held responsible for this as well. The marketing director absolutely should be gone. Anybody that pushed for and or approved this should have been booted out as well. This isn't purely the CEO. This is a multi-person issue here. So the result of this failed rebrand wiped over $100 million from Cracker Barrel's market cap. And it even sent in-store traffic sliding to below 8% of what it usually is. When I say in-store, we're talking about the people going into the restaurant to eat, right? So their traffic and their revenue declined massively. So in November of 2025, shortly after the rebrand, this CEO, she was actually on Glenn Beck's radio program. And she said, there was a statement she made that really stood out to me. She said, "I feel like I've been fired by America." And the reality is that's exactly what it is. So Cracker Barrel has always been a very traditional brand. It's out in more rural areas, generally speaking, caters to a more conservative client base, customer base, I suppose in this case. But, this is not the type of demographic that you're going to go and do this sleek, modern rebrand and expect it to do well. So to replace the CEO who stepped down, they're now bringing in the former Bloomin brand CEO, David Deno. Now, if you're not familiar with him, he's the guy who runs Bloomin Brands, which covers Outback, Carrabba's, Bonefish Grill, and one of my favorites, Fleming's Steakhouse. So this is a guy who understands restaurants really well. All of his brands have really held perfectly to their demographic. They've really aligned everything about the business to the brand, and as a result, they've been incredibly successful. There hasn't been any of these stupid, let's try to rebrand and completely change everything and let's flip the script. That's stupid. Unless you're going to completely change your business model, you don't build a completely new brand around this. So the lessons to be learned here are kind of multifaceted, right? So the first is that the public is the ultimate arbiter of your brand, especially your customer base. So it comes down to what the public thinks about you and thinks about your brand. You don't get to tell them how they should think or what they should think. This whole "we know better than you" is essentially brand suicide. And that's what happened with Bud Light. That's what happened with Cracker Barrel. That's what happened with so many other brands. And I've covered a lot of these PR crises over the years. And Bud Light, which I mentioned a second ago, was probably one of the most egregious, one of the worst handled examples. Cracker Barrel, they were terrible, but it's when the public had this intense and pretty much instant backlash, they did pivot almost immediately, like within probably a few weeks. I don't remember the exact timeline, but they pivoted. They listened to the customer base. Now, at that point, a lot of the damage had already been done. There wasn't really a fixing it situation. That's the kind of thing that tends to take months or years. And in this case, they still haven't quite recovered. But ultimately, your brand is a representation of your company. So if you are changing your brand, you have to realize that the people that were your customers or your clients, right, depending on what kind of business you're in, right? A restaurant would have customers. A professional service business would have clients, right? Kind of different scenarios. The words are not interchangeable, but there's some overlap there. But essentially, your customers or your clients are the ones that determine what your brand is. If you completely change what your brand stands for, there's a good chance you're going to lose a lot of those formerly loyal customers or clients. So the thing you have to think about is what attracts someone to your brand is the exact same thing that's going to repel someone else. So you can't create a brand that appeals to everyone. That doesn't exist. There's no such thing as that ever happening. So in order for a brand to be effective, you have to differentiate yourself. And in doing that, you're going to attract certain people, which also means you're going to repel other people. So you've got one of two approaches here. You can either choose who you want to serve, or you can choose, what is it that you believe, right? And those are kind of two angles to get to the same end result. So if you're going to build a brand around who you want to serve, well, then what you have to do is identify what matters to them and provide it. So you have to think about what values do they have? What do they stand for? Almost as important, if not more important, is what do they stand against? What do they believe? What really matters to them? And then you build a company, you build a brand around that and delivering whatever it is that is important to them. The other angle, like I said, is what do you believe? And that's another way to do it. And honestly, I think this is generally the best way to approach it because you're building something that you're passionate about, both the company and the brand, right? So you have to think about what it is you believe, and then you figure out who shares your views. What demographic is that? And then that's who you target. And I feel like this is more authentic because if you're just looking at, a particular audience that you want to serve for whatever reason, and then building a brand around that, to me, that usually feels a little bit less authentic than figuring out what it is that you believe. What do you stand for? What's important to you? And then building a brand around that and marketing that to the ideal demographic, right? So you have to figure out who they are and basically put your brand in front of them and consistently demonstrate that you are that, right? And that's how we attract those folks. So let's talk for a minute about what a brand actually is. So when we talk about branding, most people think about, the logo, maybe a catchy tagline. They might think about the color scheme, things like that. All of that shit is surface level. And ultimately, that's the last step. When it comes to a brand is really foundational. At its core, the brand is whatever the public thinks. So let's start there. And this is where we get into the difference between advertising and public relations. So advertising is what you say about your company, whereas public relations is what other people say about your company. So you can sit there and talk all day about what your brand means. But if you aren't living by the values, if you aren't running that company in a way that truly aligns with what your brand is supposed to be, none of that's going to matter. All that matters is what the public thinks, how the public perceives your brand. So what goes into a real brand, an effective brand that resonates with people? Well, there's a couple of questions that I like to ask here. And that is, like, first of all, what do you stand for? That's the most important thing, because that's going to guide everything that you do and you say in your company. It's also going to guide what you don't do and what you don't say. And that's critical because that's foundational for everything else that goes on in your company. It's how you market. It's how you do business. It's who you will and won't work with, things like that. The next question we have to ask is, who do you serve? And I see a lot of people getting this wrong because they look at it from the perspective of, oh, well, everybody can use this. Everybody would benefit from this. Everybody would find this valuable. I got a newsflash for you. No, everybody wouldn't. All right. You have to define a very focused customer or client, right? What demographic is it that you're specifically serving? Sure. If you're running a toilet paper company, yeah, everybody needs that. But then even there's probably dozens of different brands of toilet paper. But if you're running, let's say you're running a consulting firm of some sort, you're not going to work with every single company in the world because you could never do that. There's so many different industries. There's so much nuance to each industry. There's different sizes of companies. There's companies with different business models, different revenue models, different goals, different objectives, things like that. So you have to figure out exactly who it is that you're trying to work with, right? And when I talk about my company and what I do in my PR firm, Spartan Media, I talk about working with entrepreneurs who are experts at what they do, but they're not as well known as they'd like to be or as they should be. And that's something that comes from my own background, right? I had a little period where I was on my deathbed for a few years and basically disappeared from the marketing world. And I was a legitimate expert, right? I had run an agency for like 15 years at that point, and then disappeared for 2 years. So I was an expert, but now I had no recent track record at that time. This was about 12 years ago. So I basically went through this process of rebuilding myself into a recognized authority. So those are the types of people that I serve, right? People who are experts, but they don't have the notoriety. They don't have the exposure. They don't have the authority that they should, that corresponds with their level of expertise. So you have to think about something like that. There's some people in our community, both on the free PRD side, Public Relations Declassified, but then also in the private Spartan community. You got like Dr. Fern Caslow. She's a psychologist, yes, but that doesn't mean she works with everybody out there. She works with the top 1% of entrepreneurs and executives, people who are really at the top of their game and trying to move even further ahead and create more impact, right? She's got a very specific focus of who she works with. Tatiana Zavorsky, you guys have seen her. I've talked about her a bunch. She was a software developer turned real estate investor, now turned AI expert, even though she hates to use the term AI expert. But she works with people who are in the service-based industries, right? The home services, like roofers, plumbers, electricians, like big companies that are really trying to leverage, or they want to, or they need to leverage AI in their business to get more done, to be more efficient, more productive, to stop shit from falling through the cracks. Like, she has a very specific focus. So you have to look at it like that. Who specifically can you serve, or do you want to serve? And then you're going to tailor everything about your brand to that particular demographic. And that's an area that a lot of people get wrong because they think too broadly. And that comes from a kind of a scarcity mindset, right? They think, oh, well, if I narrow this down too much, then there won't be enough business. The reality is, you narrow this down to a laser focus. And what actually ends up happening is those people will find your brand far more attractive. It will resonate with them. They will feel like, oh my God, this company is in my head. They understand me. They get me. They know exactly who I am and what I need. Whereas if you're broad in general, they're just like, oh yeah, okay, this company does this thing. And that's about the extent of it. And that's the power of the brand. When you are branding specifically to communicate, to appeal to a very specific demographic, it makes your brand stand out. It creates more credibility, more authority, and more trust. And it helps you to close the right people more quickly and more easily. Okay. And then the other aspect of your brand is, why do you do what you do? Now, in my case, I do what I do because I went through this myself when I was on my deathbed for 2 years, when everything kind of went to shit and I had to rebuild everything. I was in a place where I think I was, I was probably about, late 30s, I guess, when it all happened. And so now basically at that point, I'm fucking starting over at life. Like, that's kind of terrifying when you think about it. And so I know what it's like for someone to be in that position, whether they're starting over or they've just never achieved that authority status in the first place. I know exactly what it's like to be where they are because I've gone through it. So, and I also know firsthand how powerful, how impactful that is for them. When you take somebody who's great at what they do, they're an expert, they care about their clients on a massive level. They're more effective than other people. When you can take that type of person and turn them into a recognized authority, it creates so much impact for them, for their clients, for the world as a whole. So that's why I do what I do. So you have to find the reason behind what you're doing and distill that into your brand, right? Make that a concise but powerful statement that explains to people why you're doing what you're doing. Because it's not just enough to know, what you're doing, who you're doing it for. They also want to know why you're doing it. And for anybody who is a parent, you've got kids, that everybody likes to ask why. That doesn't stop when they become a teenager. That doesn't stop when they become an adult. Even if they're not directly asking, it's always in their subconscious. They're always wanting to know why. Why does this person think this? Why does this person believe this? Why does this person want to do this particular thing? Why is this their mission? And when they understand the why, that brings more credibility to the other elements of the brand. So you have to be able to explain that. And then beyond that, everything that you do has to now align with your brand. So you can't go and say, oh, well, we stand for this. But then because you got this big opportunity, you step outside of those parameters, right? You're like, oh, well, we think that, small business is the backbone of America. But then you go and whore out for some giant corporation. Like, that is not in integrity with what your brand is supposed to be. So literally everything has to align with your brand, your words, your actions, your offerings, right? Don't go and offer some bullshit that has nothing to do with your business just because it's another revenue stream. It has to directly align with your brand. Even associations, right? Who do you associate with? Who do you partner with? Who are you engaging with on social media? All of that plays a huge role. If you're let's say, I guess we'll bring politics into it for a minute. Let's say that you're a conservative and you believe in small government. Well, it would be pretty fucking disingenuous to then go to some big political event and rub elbows with a bunch of socialist politicians, because that's not what your brand is supposed to be. That's not what you supposedly believe in. So it doesn't matter what opportunities these various things could create. You have to stay in alignment 100% with your brand. And then the aesthetics, that's the last part. Everything else is foundational. The aesthetics is just the bow that goes on the top of this. So the things like your logo, your color scheme, a tagline, even, the copy and, any of the kind of catchphrases that you may use in some of your materials or your sales calls or things like that. That's the last piece. It's the icing on the cake. It matters, but that's where most people start, and that's why they get it wrong. So you have to get these foundational aspects first, and then the aesthetics come last. And honestly, at that point, once you know exactly the answers to all of those other things, the aesthetics is the easy part. Most people just start there because it's fun and it's sexy and it's entertaining and all of that. That's not the right approach. So get the foundation right. Everything else from there is a piece of cake, in my opinion. So that's going to lead us into Jeremy's PR PSA for the day. And that is that the public, not you, decides what your brand stands for. So if you don't like how it's being perceived, it's 100% on you to prove who you really are. The public is going to base their perception of your brand on what they see you say, what they see you do, who they see you associate with, what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do. All of these things are what shape the public perception. So if you're out here doing things that are not in alignment with your brand, the public is going to see your brand based on all of those things, not what you tell them. And this whole, we know better than you, and here's what my brand is, none of that shit matters. All that matters is how they perceive your brand. Now, if the public does not see your brand the way that you want them to see it, it's incumbent on you to then take a look and see where the disconnect is, right? What are you doing that doesn't align with the brand that you are trying to present? You need to figure out what those issues are. You need to fix them. You need to communicate those fixes. You need to say, maybe you did something that is not in alignment. Well, now stand up, acknowledge that, and make it public, right? But you have to consistently act in alignment with your brand in order for people to see your brand the way that you want them to see it. You're not going to be able to tell them, this is how you have to see my brand. It doesn't matter what you say. All that matters is how they perceive it. So if there's a disconnect, that's on you to fix it, and you fix it through consistent words and actions, right? What you're saying, what you're doing, who you're associating with, how you're operating is going to determine how people see your brand. So that's a wrap for today, guys. Look forward to seeing you all on the next episode. And if you guys found anything valuable in this, I'd love it if you'd go over to YouTube, drop a comment over there. If there's somebody who can benefit from this, love it if you'd share this with them so that they can get that information and apply it in their business. And I will see you all in the next episode. Thanks, everyone.